Cryptozoology and Cryptids thread. Cryptids are animals whose existence is not recognized by academic science. A cryptid can be a creature that is considered extinct, or that is described in legends, but of the existence of which there is only eyewitness testimony. In Russia, there should be a lot of cryptids due to the vastness of the territories and their poor development. And surely a lot of Anons have seen something inexplicable. Share your stories about encounters with animals unknown to science. I saw a giant bat. I noticed movement in the sky in the late evening. At first I decided that it was a stork, which are almost extinct here. But from the shape of the wings and the pace of the flaps, I realized that this was not a stork, or a bird in general, although the size was the same. Later I googled. The only thing that I found were rare giant night birds, but they should be much smaller. Flying dogs, chanterelles, and other exotic fruit bats are not found here. Fishermen often talk about fish they have caught, but usually it all comes down to descriptions like, it looks like a sturgeon, only with a flat beak and no eyes, or, a fish, like a fish, only with a long tail without fins. More likely some kind of mutant or squirrel than real cryptids. My grandmother lived in Azerbaijan in her youth. She talked about wild people, who can be found in the mountains. According to the descriptions, they are the same as a yeti, only shorter and walking on bent legs, leaning on their hands. According to local stories, they live in caves, and they come to the surface only by chance or from hunger. But imagine if some Jigit tribals really were swallowed by caves and formed another tribe, and for several generations degraded there to an animal state. There are already examples of this in Afghanistan. When I was 10 years old and I was visiting my family in the village, my grandfather told me that when he was young, they had stories about strange birds that looked like people with feathers and the head of a rooster. Giant flightless owls. The famous species, Ornitomegalonyx, for example, became extinct several thousand years ago, but in the north they are said to still be found today. In a dark forest, these fuckers really can be mistaken for a person. Bird people, inhabitants of the underworld. Most likely not birds or people, but some kind of surviving and evolved branch of bird-like dinosaurs. We saw some snake worm in the garden. It looked like a large, much larger than an earthworm, black worm. No thickening in the area of the head, mouth, or eyes was discernible, although viewed very closely. That is, the shape of the end, like the ends of a worm, is simply semicircular. When there, the body itself gave off a mother-of-pearl color. The most logical thing is that it was a small snake, but they still have a rather distinguishable head and a tapering sharp tail in comparison, and here it was exactly like a worm body. And we have never seen snakes in the city, they are unlikely to be found here at all. At the country house, little snakes would come around but they look different. I remember that once upon a time, in 2014, one Anon, either in a thread about village stories, or in some other thread, told a cool story about how he and other kids dug a hole for something, and he chopped off a thick root with a shovel. It seemed to be a root. Something 5 centimeters thick. And then bam, this root took off and sucked into the ground, bleeding orange snot. I think there is some kind of worm or serpentine cryptid in Eurasia. And, apparently, there are many varieties. For 10 years now I have been trying to understand what I saw one July night in the summer at the country house. It was like this: I went out into the courtyard to take care of some business. The time was already somewhere after midnight. The sky was clear, and there was enough moonlight to make out the courtyard and the garden that adjoined it. Movement in the garden caught my attention. There was a straight path through the garden to the house, and this little animal was moving along it, in my direction. Most likely, if not for its movement, I wouldn't have even looked, and just finished my business and went to bed. The neighbors' cats were constantly wandering around the site, and a small dog could climb through the gaps in the old fence. But again, the way this thing moved seemed unusual to me already in the first second of observation. These were short, but very frequent jumps on the hind limbs. The nocturnal visitor itself, when compared with all existing animals, was very similar to a kangaroo, only 30 to 50 centimeters in height, with white short hair, a hunched back, a muzzle resembling something between a rat or a dog. The shit seemed to simply not notice me, although it was impossible from its perspective, and continued to move. Then I fumbled a little, ran into the house, and went to bed. In the morning I told my grandparents about everything. They just laughed and said that it was probably a cat. But I am sure that I could not confuse this with a cat, fox, ferret, and other representatives of the local fauna. By the way, this year a wave of killings of poultry, chickens, geese, ducks, swept across the village and in the whole district. Moreover, judging by the stories of the deaths, the dead carcasses were not taken and eaten, as a fox would do. In addition to me, there were those in the surrounding villages who talked about seeing exactly the same thing. In general, most of all, this is similar to how chupacabra is described, but this is just ridiculous due to the fact that its descriptions are very different, and how the character of the American urban legend migrated to our outback. It is also strange that such crap only occurred for 1 year. One summer, to be more precise. One gets the impression that this creature wanders. In general, I would like to ask a question: is there something rare in the territory of Central Russia, similar in description? Perhaps some kind of vole mice, meadow jerboas, etc. In the Black Sea around the Crimea, a certain population of relic relatives of dinosaurs actually lives. The spring of 1952 in Kotovel was cold and rainy. Even April was so-so, and May was rainy and cold. On May 14th, after prolonged cold weather, calm warm weather set in. Assuming that during the storms the sea threw a lot of colored stones on the shore, I again walked past Devil's Finger, along the Djurbak Gorge, and then, so as not to waste a lot of time on the difficult descent to the seashore in the Carnelian Bay, on a rock, near a tree, from where the whole bay is visible, the width of which is 200 to 250 meters, I tied a rope and easily went down with it. The sea, I repeat, was quiet. Near the shore, among small stones overgrown with algae, a mullet played. Far away, about 100 meters from the shore, dolphins swam. Dolphins in a school moved along the bay to the left. The mullet must have moved there. I turned my eyes to the right, and just in the middle of the bay, 50 meters from the coast, I noticed a large, 10 to 12 meters in circumference, stone overgrown with brown algae. In my life I have been to Kotovel many times, and in each visit I have been to the Serdolikovaya Bay several times. The bay is not shallow, the depth begins about 10 paces from the coast, and I don't remember the stone in the middle of the bay. It was 200 meters from me to the stone. I didn't have binoculars with me. I could not see the stone. And is it a stone? I leaned back, put my eye against the knot of the tree, and noticed that the stone deviates noticeably to the right. So it was not a stone, but a large ball of seaweed. Torn away by storms, where did they bring them here? Maybe they will be nailed to the rocks by the current and I should look at them. I forgot the dolphins. While smoking my pipe, I began to observe the ball of seaweed. The current seemed to be intensifying. The algae began to lose their rounded shape. The ball has lengthened. Breaks appeared in the middle. And then I trembled all over, got to my feet and sat up, as if afraid that I might scare it if I stood on my feet. I looked at my watch. It was 12:15 p.m. There was perfect silence. Behind me, in the Djurbak Valley, birds chirped, and my pipe was vigorously smoking. The ball unfolded, turned around, stretched out. I continued watching and no longer considered it as algae, until it moved upstream. This creature swam in undulating movements to the place where the dolphins were, that is, to the left side of the bay. Everything was still quiet. Naturally, it immediately occurred to me, is this not a hallucination? I took out my watch. It was 12:18 p.m. The distance, the shine of the sun on the water, interfered with the reality of what I saw, but the water was transparent, and therefore I saw the bodies of dolphins, which were twice as far from me as the monster. It was large, very large, 25 to 30 meters, and as thick as a desktop if turned sideways. It was underwater half a meter, or a meter, and, it seemed to me, was flat. The lower part of it was, apparently, white, as far as the blue of the water made it possible to understand this, and the upper part was dark brown, which allowed me to mistake it for algae. The monster, wriggling, like a swimming snake, did not quickly swim towards the dolphins. They immediately disappeared. This happened on May 14, 1952. Having chased away the dolphins and, perhaps, not even thinking of chasing them, the monster curled up into a ball, and the current carried it back to the right. It again began to resemble a brown stone overgrown with algae. Carried to the middle of the bay, just to that place or approximately to where I saw it for the first time, the monster turned around again and, turning towards the dolphins, suddenly raised its head above the water. The head, the size of the span of a man's arms, was like a snake. I still did not see the eyes, from which one could conclude that they were small. After holding its head above the water for 2 minutes, large drops of water flowed from it. The monster turned sharply, lowered its head into the water and quickly swam behind the rocks that closed the Carnelian Bay. I looked at my watch. It was 3 minutes to 1. I watched the monster for a little over 40 minutes. In 1967, Ludmila Zagita stepped over a log on a walk in the Armatluk Valley in the autumn evening. Hearing a splash from behind, she saw a huge, log-thick, snake crawling from one reservoir to another. The log she had stepped over was not there. From an article by the director of the Karadag Reserve P.G. Semenkova, on December 7, 1990, a brigade of fishermen of the Karadag branch of the Inbyum Academy of Sciences of Ukraine, consisting of A.H. Sabanov, Y.M. Nuikin, M.M. Sich, and N.V. Gerasimov, went to sea to check the nets supplied for catching Black Sea rays. The net is canvas, 2.5 meter wide, and 200 meter long with a mesh size of 200 millimeters. It was installed at a depth of 50 meters with coordinates 3 miles southeast of Lyagushakia Bay and 7 miles south of the Orjanikij village. Arrived at about noon and began to retrieve the net from the southern end. After 150 meters, the net appeared to be torn off, and the fishermen decided that when setting up, they had thrown their net over someone else's, and the owner of the lower net was forced to cut the upper net in order to check theirs. They went the other end of the net and continued checking. When we went to the ragged edge, we pulled a dolphin onto the surface, a Black Sea bottlenose dolphin about 230 centimeters in size, whose tail was entangled in a net. Pulling the dolphin up to the nose of the boat, the fishermen found that the dolphin's belly had been bitten by one bite. The width of the bite along the arc is about 1 meter. Along the edge of the arc, the teeth marks were clearly visible on the dolphin's skin. The size of the tooth mark is about 40 millimeters, distance between teeth marks is about 15 to 20 millimeters. There were about 16 tooth marks in total along the arc. The dolphin's belly was bitten out with ribs, so that the spine was clearly visible. In the area of the head, the remains of the lungs dangled, from which blood flowed down during lifting. Teeth marks were clearly visible on the sides, and were arranged symmetrically. The dolphin's head was severely deformed, evenly compressed on all sides, as if they were trying to drag it into a narrow hole. The eyes were not visible and the deformed part was whitish, resembling the color of a fish pulled from the stomach of another fish. Dolphin inspection lasted no more than 3 minutes. The sight of the dolphin and the flowing blood caused a great panic among the fishermen. One of them cut the net, the dolphin fell into the sea, and the fishermen left the area at full speed for home. I saw the fishermen immediately upon their return from the sea, inquired in detail about what had happened, and based on their story, the artist made a sketch of the dolphin they saw. In the spring of 1991, fishermen brought a second dolphin with similar tooth marks on its body. It was 1.5 meters in size. They pulled him out of the net, which was installed in approximately the same place as on December 7, 1990. This time, the net was not torn, and almost the entire dolphin was heavily entangled in the net, wrapped like a doll, so that only the head peeped out. Traces of 3 teeth were clearly visible on the dolphin's head. In appearance, they exactly looked like the teeth marks on the body of the bottlenose dolphin. The dolphin was put into a cold chamber, and in May 1991, being in Leningrad, I went to the Institute of Zoology, talked with a number of employees, and invited them to see the dolphin. Unfortunately, none of the staff were able to travel, but I received the address of the specialists on the marks found on the bodies of marine mammals harvested in the ocean. These were Yugniro employees working in Kerch and Odessa. I managed to contact one of them by phone. I described in detail the marks found on the bodies of the dolphins entangled in our nets, and invited him to inspect the dolphin, which we kept in our cold chamber. I was promised that he would try to find time to come to our institution. However, neither in May, nor in June, nor in July, no one came to us. At the end of August, there was an accident, and everything that was in the cold chamber was lost, including the dolphin. In the last thread, we discussed the Karadag snake from the Black Sea, but relatively close, near Rostov, there is another, the Aksai Monster. The Aksai Monster is a bloodthirsty creature allegedly living near the city of Aksai, Rostov Oblast. According to the local belief, the monster lives in caves, of which there are many in the area. According to an employee of the local military history museum, Vyacheslav Zaporozhtsev, in the 50s, a segment of a group of military men disappeared. And when they found the bodies, they saw that the bodies of the dead were severely mutilated, one might say, torn to pieces. One had no head, in many places meat and skin had been torn from the bones, and the other had almost half of the body missing. Even the metal box with the field telephone was chewed. In addition, farmers in these places are losing their livestock, despite the fact that all the predators were exterminated more than 40 years ago. And here's another, there is an underground lake under Aksai at a depth of 40 meters. The underground sea is 200 meters deeper. An underground river flows under the river. All these bodies of water are associated with the catacombs and periodically flood them. Are there any anons from those places that can confirm this? I myself am from Rostov. In my teens with a friend, I read these stories and decided to explore the area near the Aksai Bridge, the Kobyak settlement, about which there are a lot of urban legends. They say, somewhere there are entrances to these caves. We found a couple of interesting places, but all the tunnels ended up being filled up. In general, the geology there is such that the passages are actively formed by groundwater, but they are unstable. Both natural and artificially dug passages are unstable and subject to subsidence of the rock. Of the interesting things in that area, the Cossack passages of the 17th and 18th centuries are still periodically found, which are also covered up, although in one place there is even a museum, well, the unfinished headquarters of the indigenous people, with its underground entrances. But this is a busy place where whole generations of Aksai and Rostovites go to grow numbers and feel like diggers. P.S. About the underground river and reservoir, it seems to be a scientific fact, but I am too lazy to look for proofs. Rescuers said that in the area of the Aksai Bridge at the bottom of the river, a large crater sucked in cars that fell from the bridge, and even divers a couple of times. One day people went to visit relatives in Tatarstan, and for some time lived in the village there, and so the locals often talked about some local version of the Yeti or Bigfoot, I don't remember the name in the local language. According to the description, they are classic, tall, ape-like people. The main thing of these was that they often carry huge weapons with them, swords, axes, or bows the size of themselves. That is, they are huge, considering that they are taller than a person. Where they find or produce them, it was not specified, because they live in a primitive system in obscurity and do not know blacksmithing. They are not aggressive towards people. If you do not fuck up their children, you can convince them to offer protection, which they did in ancient times. On the topic of the thread, on the border of the Novgorod, Tver, and Pskov regions, locals in the swamps and in the rivers regularly see very large snakes and some kind of rodent, suspiciously reminiscent of giant salamanders. One of the locals is my uncle, who assured me that in 1999, during a hike for mushrooms, he saw a snake that was 3.5 to 4 meters long. It didn't come close to him, but he got a very good look at it. Since he is the only teetotaler in the entire town, I believe him. Another well-known grandmother also said that she saw a snake about 3 meters long. In the photo, also from there by the way, of course, not 4 meters, as the local newspaper used to report, but 1.5 to 2 meters, which is also dead. Usually, it is more than a meter, and a viper does not grow more than 70 centimeters. Also, somewhere in those places, the legendary Russian crocodiles allegedly lived. We have a few mammoths left in the Siberian taiga, but there are very few of them. Yes, I saw them. They still cut off spruce branches with their trunks and eat them. They like to eat young large trees. I remember when I was 6 years old, I came to my grandparents in the village in the summer. So, one evening I was playing with the neighbor boy next to my grandmother's place, and then I was looking at a tree growing in the garden. On it sat something that remotely resembled a large monkey 2 meters tall. I was not particularly scared then, rather surprised by this picture. And the monkey, as it seemed to me, glancing at me, began to jump on the neighboring trees, moving away from us. The boy next door saw her too, but soon forgot about the incident. My grandfather once told me a story about his father. It was in the 1930s. On a warm summer day, my great-grandfather decided to go fishing. He went to the ponds next to our village. There was a spacious field between the village and the ponds. So, he walks and sees a giant snake 10 meters long, which was far enough from him. He never went to these ponds again after.